Is this another Dutch tulip, speculative play where exuberance takes over, rationality takes a back seat, and things are getting funded left, right, and centre?
Hello and welcome to Identity Today, your go-to for what's what and all things security, digital identity and biometric tech. I'm your host, Blair Crawford. Today in the show we welcome back regular guest Peter Coroneos. Today we're calling BS on what's become an overexposed and noisy cybersecurity sector. Really hope you enjoy the chat.
I think it might be worthwhile to take 1 minute to discuss security.
Welcome back to the show, Peter. Great to have you on again as our staple regular.
Thanks, Blair. Great to be back.
We're calling BS on cyber, whatever that means today. Lots to discuss. Not sure exactly where the conversation will take us outside of the sprawling preparation sessions we've done in advance of today. But I think one of the things that we've been speaking about a lot is there's a whole lot of noise in cyber right now, and we just keep adding to it. And ironically, I hope we don't just add to the noise with this podcast. We'll try and avoid that and provide some real strong guidance. How do we strip out the noise and why is it happening?
Firstly, congratulations on your courage of picking the topic heading for today. I think that potentially a lot of people could be offended by what we're going to say today, but that's not the intention, really. Our intention is really to, I guess, bring back a sense of perspective into this whole area in which we work. And I'd like to think today I can bring a little bit of a historical perspective because, of course, to me, and to those of us that are, older than probably 25, this is reminiscent of the dot-com boom of the late 90s, early 2000s, in the sense that, there are a number of quite distinct parallels, aren't there? There's the rapid uptake in the use of the technology, particularly post-pandemic. It's been forced, those that hadn't already digitally transformed were forced to do so within weeks. And so you've had this rapid remotification, which means you've got a much larger cohort of people, of security situations that you need to manage. But in addition to that, the other sort of major parallel is, of course, that where there's money and market, then there are going to be a lot of entrants. And I think the barriers to entry are possibly a bit lower now as well. With cybersecurity, there are that many products and services available that it really has become a very noisy marketplace. And I think one of the major challenges is for anyone that's selling into the cybersecurity market is how do you get heard above the noise? And as you observe, there is so much noise, and I think what we're all wishing for is a little more signal within that noise. And so I thought it was ironic when we talked last week in preparation for today that we were saying we only hope that this session isn't going to be just adding more noise. So I think we've set a high bar.
You said it was funny almost that we compared the cybersecurity industry because it seems like so many people and so many organizations are coming into the market. It's making it very difficult for CISOs to make decisions and for strategy to be developed because there are different opinions. But we made a comparison to almost being like the tulip bubble.
That's right.
Is cyber becoming a kind of bubble right now and it's going to crash and leave the best players behind, or what do you think?
Well, it kind of feels like it. You could say the same about crypto as well. It's like we're seeing a few things in sort of proliferating in tandem. And of course, the Dutch tulip bubble was the first historical precedent we had for this, and we often referred to it during the dot-com boom. And is this another Dutch tulip, speculative play where, exuberance takes over, rationality takes a back seat, and things are getting funded left, right, and centre, irrespective of their business model or their profit plan. And of course, we did see that. And unfortunately, there were a really lot of good ideas that emerged during the heady days of the early 2000s, when the dot-com really hit its stride. And the shame is that because of this lack of discipline in the market, as it were, lack of rigor in the way things were being invested, and I think also the unrealistic payback periods that the investors were looking for, it caused a lot of good ideas to falter some of which resurfaced because they were just strong ideas. But others I think we've lost. And it kind of feels like the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, historically, that when human knowledge is lost, we kind of all suffer. And so I think that that was one of the lessons for me in the dot-com crash. It was, in a way, a relief because there was a lot of bad stuff out there that was just never going to be adding value to any kind of human problem. But there was also a lot of, a few gems in there that we lost as well. And I think to the topic for today, how do we get good products to market in a way that they can sufficiently stand above the rest? And I think also, how do we get the buyers, the CISOs in particular, who are so overwhelmed by the noise to the point where it's affecting their own mental health? What can we do to bring them an easier life where the decision-making is a little more rational and, to your point about calling BS, what did I see? Cisco, I think, gave a presentation a couple of years ago where they said that the average mid to large size organization can have up to 60 different cybersecurity products in the ecosystem. And then, of course, the more products you add, the more complexity you add. They don't always talk nicely to each other. So there's a whole lot of issues that arise simply through the proliferation of solutions out there. And I guess the CISO, they're trying to manage so many areas of risk, aren't they? Particularly human risk, which I hope we'll get to talk about a bit today. Really, the technology stepping in to take over from the complete subversion of the human natural defensive system in the face of increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks. So you kind of have to have a broad spectrum of this layered defense kind of approach. You need that. But I was going to say, at what point is enough enough?
Well, I think that's enough is enough, and we talk a lot about, if we talk about a noise and the options which sit from the vendor community to prospective market, execution will play a big part in this, and I think execution is becoming difficult for organizations to achieve if, for example, you have things like CISO fatigue or team member fatigue, but also issues of interoperability across all these different great ideas that are being purchased into an organization. I've seen a lot of the work that you've done recently talking about execution and providing true human value as an outcome. Be keen to get your insight into that.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach. I think it's sort of worked for me, particularly in confusing times where it's very hard to see the wood for the trees. And for me, the apocryphal tale was 1998, when I'd just taken over the reins of the Internet Industry Association, and we'd entertained Bill Clinton's e-commerce czar. It was the sort of beginning of this whole era of governments officially recognizing that the internet was here and was rapidly becoming commercialized. And I guess as a thank you, he asked my chairman, what can I do to repay your kindness in having me here? And he said, why don't you just take Peter to America and give him a tour of internet facilities? The thing that struck me, having seen some of their, advanced R&D and talking to some of their big users of the internet, was the last session that we had in the lobby of the San Jose Hotel, where they brought two cultural anthropologists from the University of San Jose. And the topic was the human factors that they were observing during this revolution, being in the seat, as it were, the crucible, of the cradle of innovation. And these guys were looking at what the impacts of the technology were on the innovators themselves. And their premise was that if the technology was as good as what the evangelists said it was, then the people that had the most access to it, or to the most advanced technology, should be leading happier and more fulfilled lives. And I thought, well, that's a really interesting take on technology. And when you think about it, it's right. What's the point of all of this if it's not going to improve our lives in some way. But they found, shockingly, that instead of them living enriched, leisure-filled lives that were being enabled by technology and workload being ameliorated and more time with their family and their kids and less stress, they found the complete opposite, that these people were overworked, they were driven, they barely saw their families at all, and if anything, the technology was making them more miserable. And it really struck me. And if you fast forward to now, which is like nearly 25 years after that, and we're looking at our own lives and Zoom fatigue and, the whole pandemic, foisting technology on us in a way that isn't necessarily optimal, then it just struck me that, those questions about why are we doing all of this and how is the technology actually helping us? I mean, I think that's a really important question, and certainly that experience guided a lot of my thinking while I was with the Internet Industry Association. And often I'd be asked to sort of predict, the future evolution of technology and where people were going to pick up some innovations and not others. For me, it always came back to what is the human problem that's being addressed here. So always it's remember the human. So, to your point about cyber fatigue and a lot of these factors that we're still confronting today that we really haven't solved in cybersecurity, it's always about, in the end, it's about human propensities, human emotional drivers, and the capacity to enhance and not to degrade our own cognitive reserves, the amount of available free space we've got to process information and make informed decisions. And so circling back to our CISO example, I mean, here we've got people that are at the limits of their cognitive reserve because of the sheer volume of new information that they're having to process and they're getting foisted upon them. And so I think, I'm going to say it, Blair, I mean, you and I both do meditation now, and we do it to create a little bit of mental space. And don't you find, and you can edit this out if you think it's inappropriate, but I'm going to say it. I think that the antidote for all this overload is really to just step back and give yourself a little bit of space. And I think that addresses the topic today, which is taking the BS out of cyber, because it's about stepping back and looking at the big picture. What are we actually trying to achieve here? And is there a holistic, sort of more integrated way that we can do what we're doing, keeping the human central, or alternatively, and again, this will be controversial, taking humans out of the loop altogether?
There's a couple of there's a couple of pathways I can go in here. I can continue down the meditation path. I can talk to you about, well, someone said to me, one of the clients we're working with, and talking about the cyber fatigue thing for a second, they just said, we want you to help us from a security perspective of giving us a solution that doesn't get in the way of our people doing what it is they need to do. We don't want, in this Zoom fatigue or MFA fatigue or authentication fatigue and all these other things which get in the way of people just either being fulfilled in their professional or their personal roles. And then keeping the human in the center of the design for things like security is key as well. But, not to just completely sidestep your meditation piece, I think it is important for a lot of the operators professionally in general to find a way to step back, as you said, from, they get in the weeds too much. And there needs to be some practical tools which help people say, hold on a minute, what is the bigger picture? And whether that's meditation or running or cycling or a magnitude of other things, I think that is one of the major issues which we have in the security ecosystem right now. It is extremely difficult to say that way is best versus that way. And I think one of the other issues that's driving that is overwhelming amounts of standards being published across different regions, whether it's physical security standards, cybersecurity standards, international global perspectives on standards, privacy standards, ethical standards. That combined with option on approach, we've got to be able to step back and make some more informed decisions. and facilitate the people in our teams to make decisions without, I think, overwhelming pressure. Because there probably isn't a perfectly right answer. Like, there isn't a right answer.
If it's a human problem, the answers are going to be extremely complex, multidimensional, multifaceted. The thing about making the technology as transparent as possible is, I think, where we want to go, but how we get there isn't clear. If technology, this comes back to this discussion I had with these cultural anthropologists. If technology is, you get in your car and you start the car, and these days it starts the first time, not like the first cars we used to own when we were students. Car, you get in, you start the car, it works. You don't have to know how it works. You form an intention as to your destination, and basically the car takes you there. And if you're any kind of experienced driver, you'll hardly be conscious of the processes at all that took you there. And you'll arrive safely because of all the inbuilt systems that, by and large, are keeping us safer on the roads. Now, it's not a bad analogy to think about IT, information systems, which are anything but as mature as cars. The whole issues we've got with poor software security, which, if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have said we should have had resolved by now. But the fact that you've got exploitation of code, bugs still in the production process. Someone did say they tried to get softwares to be subject to the fitness for purpose regulations that govern other products in the market, and the industry resisted bitterly. And I think with some justification, in the sense that they said, well, we can't foresee every possible use case and every possible third-party add-on that's going to be used in combination with our software, how they might interact. But on the other hand, I think they made some joke about if an operating system was a car, it'd never be allowed on the road.
It's like getting back to your point about I need to look back on it and removing humans from some of the conversations that we have here, and the application of AI.
Yeah.
And I know you've got some thoughts on whether we have real AI or not, or we just have application-specific interpretations of AI.
Well, there's no generalized AI yet, although, it's been promised for decades. I presume with enough computing power and enough people researching it, over time we'll eventually get to some approximation of generalized intelligence, artificial intelligence. But, definitely we're getting much better at building intelligence into products and services. That's happening. It really is one of the hot areas of innovation, isn't it? The whole automation piece. So I think, we would expect that evolution will continue. And of course, with machine learning systems, and particularly sort of self-learning systems, you would obviously expect that trajectory to accelerate as well. So I think it's foreseeable that within the next 10 years, let's say, you would have fairly capable intelligent systems that are driving a lot of, or supplementing, if not replacing, a lot of human processes. And I think for us in cybersecurity, that's probably the great hope, because I honestly think, I've been thinking about this a lot over the years. What can we do to make humans take a more conscious approach to their use of technology and the decisions they make, particularly in respect of, even phishing emails is a classic and still very current example. And of course, the bad guys are getting so much better at exploitation as well. I really feel like a couple of years ago, at least, we reached the tipping point where the average user of technology probably is not in a position now to distinguish or differentiate between a benign communication and a malicious one. So I think we've already lost that battle. The question is now, do we use machines to take up the slack, or do we have to somehow modify humans? Tricky. I think probably the former, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
We probably have to find a balance between automation and using technology to support us, but I still think that there is a place for a cognitively optimized human at the helm of the ship, so to speak. And I think it touches on your point around the size of fatigue and the mental health piece. We're probably trying to do too much with a small group, if not a single individual. And we need to allow that person, the CISO in the example, to be optimized and then have the appropriate controls and also supporting technologies around them, plus teams. You did touch on the mental health piece. It seems to be coming up regularly across, not just across conversation generally, but there is a specific type of mental health conversation and developing around the security fraternity, because they are just under so much pressure to protect so much.
That's
what
right.
are you thinking there?
I think that's right. I mean, I think I reached a realization that really through the pandemic, I've been watching the declining mental health as reported of people that are working from home. And of course, then that becomes a vulnerability that is opened, that the CISO then has to manage in addition to all the other issues. So in other words, if your remote workers are stressed and fearful and confused and afraid and not knowing if they're going to keep their job or if they're going to keep their lives, even, the way the media would have us interpret this narrative on the pandemic. These are people that you're asking to make informed, rational, and cautious decisions in respect of the use of the communications technology, and knowing all the while that only one of them needs to slip up for a compromise to occur, and then you, the CISO, whose job is on the line, are going to have to contend with that. And so what I guess we're saying is that there's an interaction between the mental health of the user base that the CISO is managing and the CISO's own mental health. And both of those become factors in the risk posture of the organization. And so I don't think we can divorce, and this is why I don't mind talking about meditation when I talk about cybersecurity now. It's because I think, whether it's meditation or some tool that's going to help restore a bit of a mental and emotional balance, I think that needs to become part of the cybersecurity narrative. I think there's some real interesting insights that have emerged, particularly during COVID. For me, I'm seeing a lot of parallels between cyber fatigue, which we could define as people that are basically just giving up on following the kind of advice, the training that we're giving them, and they're just entering into a stage of non-compliance, partly because they're not within the network environment of the traditional workplace, but partly because the literature is saying that they're actually acting rationally. If someone's got limited mental reserves, cognitive reserves and emotional reserves due to stress, and you put an additional imposition on them, which is to do this training or to follow these procedures or policies, and they're already feeling swamped and overwhelmed and stressed, they're going to make the risk-benefit calculation on what happens if they don't comply. And so the literature is suggesting that it's a rational decision for them if they reasonably conclude that there's not going to be any direct consequence on them in the short term, and they're totally overwhelmed, they're going to throw it overboard just so that they can stay afloat. And with COVID compliance, I think it's the same dynamic. People are feeling sick of being restricted. It's playing on their mental health. That they don't want to wear a mask that feels limiting. It's sort of like using a two-factor authentication or what you said before, other security measures that we seek to put between the individual and the risk environment. Well, we're doing the same thing with masks, social distancing, asking them to be vaccinated when they may have genuine doubts about it. All of these things play into a mindset which starts to rear up against the advice. And as a result, you see riots and protests in cities because people they've reached the tipping point. So I think cyber fatigue, to counter that, we need to think of different new ways to engage people that play more to their actual perception of risk as they encounter it. See, we are rational in the sense you wouldn't cross a road in front of a truck if you saw it coming. So there you're performing a risk calculation. But there's a proximate element to that you can see straight away what would happen if you were reckless. With cyber, we don't have that parallel. We don't have that a surrogate for that. And so this is part of the reason that the fatigue is there, is because they have to feel that what they're being asked to do is actually relevant and will deliver outcomes. If they can't see, and part of the problem, I think, again, of CISOs is that you're defending against attacks that may never happen. And so you're asking for resources in case something might happen. If it doesn't happen, then the argument is, well, that money wasn't well spent. But of course, the one time that it does happen, you're probably marched out the door.
And I think the other part of that is that it's very hard to always be on in anything. You have to have a break. And I think that's a key point that you've made there. You don't know the form of an attack. And if you're just one person, for example, at CISO, then you always have to be on a state of alert. There isn't really a redundancy plan for a CISO.
No.
So either something happens to the organization and the CISO may go, for one example. But if they don't, there isn't, and they become fatigued, or they are fatigued, and they become, they have to go into a reactive mode to address the situation which is unfolding in front of them. Or if they leave because it's too much, the pressure's too much, the state of always being on, there is no redundancy plan for CISOs.
No.
You don't build that into your organization. If someone leaves one way or another, bringing in a new CISO to figure out to the nuanced detail that would be required to protect an organization, it's just unreasonable to ask. Can you imagine the
exercise?
Can you imagine the onboarding?
Unbelievable. And the cost, I mean, even looking at it in economic terms, I mean, I prefer to look at it in human terms because I just think that perspective is a little more compassionate, and ultimately, we're trying to support the people at the level at which they're suffering, which is this whole emotional distress and overload. But even economically, I mean, any board should understand that if you subject any key player to an unreasonable set of demands over an extended period of time, you're going to burn them out. And that's what's happening. So I think our job as an industry, with a voice here, is to ventilate this whole dynamic a little more and get it out there and to say, listen, what does a solution look like here that isn't about more and more and more? Because, this is part of the issue. The easy thing to do, which I don't think is easy at all, would be to just acquire more security products and services and try and just plaster the place full of things that you don't know how they're going to interact. So, as I say, the more complexity you bring into this, you're actually ultimately making things even harder and adding to your stress. But is there an evolution? And going back to the .com days when you said, what did we learn from that? One of the things was there were rationalizations which occurred after the fact, where you demonstrated a business case and then it was about aggregating market share. And I think we saw that in the ISP sector in Australia as well, that you tend to get the economies of scale start coming in, you start to aggregate, then you got budgets, you can innovate, deliver better services. So I suspect that at some point we're going to see a rationalization in the cybersecurity sector, and it may form around the race to AI. If someone could develop a truly effective AI that would counter a lot of the threats and ameliorate these human-based risks, they would definitely have an advantage. But I don't see that there's really anything yet, no silver bullet yet.
Kind of sounds like the Darwinization of the cybersecurity industry.
Yeah, we talked about that too, didn't we? I mean, but that is the nature of innovation. I mean, we shouldn't feel... Part of the problem here is as well, Blair, you and I are standing within the morass looking around us. And it seems all very chaotic and confusing, but what we need to do is to, levitate to 10,000 feet and take the bird's eye view or the low Earth orbit satellite view of the entire landscape, and whether we can discern patterns from a larger perspective that can give us a better fix on where we are in relation to where we want to go. And I don't know what that looks like, but sometimes I feel like it's a useful exercise to just get out of the weeds a bit.
I think one of the things that that we're kind of tossing up as an organization that provides technology is this idea where you need to let the market know there's a capability there. You don't want to be noisy and pointless in terms of the messaging or just regurgitating a pointless point. And you also want to be conscious that really, if you strip it back, security should be on a need-to-know basis. So those are two, it's almost like an oxymoron, because you have to shout, we're here, we have this capability to be able to address X, Y, and Z. But if you strip back security, well, we shouldn't be telling you about that if we really want to protect you. And getting that balance from a marketing perspective, but also from a security perspective in this very noisy environment is something that I think we need to be better at within the vendor community generally. It's kind of back to that, would you rather be rich or famous?
A long time ago, I did a little night school course on marketing because I was trying to start a little business in my 20s, just fooling around. And my dad said, well, we'll go to night school and learn a bit about marketing and advertising. And there was a lecturer that was, I guess, within that industry that was telling us about the most effective advertising. And it was about cutting through the noise. And he showed us this ad. And it was a full page they'd taken out. And there was like 10 words in the middle of the blank page. And your immediate response was to think, well, what a waste of space. But in fact, they had all that room. They could have said so much more. And he points out that, in fact, that was a brilliant strategy because it forced the market to look at what it was that you were saying, given that you had all that space and you only chose to use this much of it. What was it? What was the gem? What was the distilled wisdom that you were seeking to impart in such an apparently extravagant way? So I kind of feel like there's a metaphor there for what we're talking about is maybe less is more and create some spaciousness and let's reverse the noise in the market. I don't know. How do you ask all your competitors to do that, though? That's the hard part.
Well, Edwina's listening into this podcast as we record it. So for everybody listening, Edwina's our head of communication. So I hope she's trying to figure that out as we speak. I think one of the places I want to finish up here today, we've talked about how many entrants are coming into the market. We're talking about how much money is being invested into the market without necessarily clear or at least obvious information about the types of returns that can actually be achieved across the industry based on value and also based on the value that we're providing to the end users of technology. But I think if we think fear and greed typically drive the share market, what is it that's more specifically driving the cybersecurity industry in your opinion?
It's tempting to say fear and greed, because if you're an investor, then whether you choose to invest in, pork bellies or concentrated orange juice or cybersecurity is really a perception of the growth and the return that you're going to get against the risk of the investment. So I think the dynamic is fairly constant. But, I mean, in terms of the innovators themselves, so I'm far more interested in the people within our industry that are trying to think through better approaches. I honestly do see still a very strong ethic around, and I know it's a cliche, but making the world a better place. I see it very strongly, Blair. I mean, even within our Cyan membership, you know the guys that, are members here, and I know that international ones too, and everyone's got this real, and this kind of echoes what the cultural anthropologists were saying. This was the other part of their analysis, was I said, well, why do these people stay in the technology industry if they're so miserable? If it's so difficult? And they said, well, because they all had one thing in common, and that was that they all absolutely believed that the thing that they were working on was genuinely going to help humanity. And there's some really interesting research that's come out of one of the main US universities on attracting talent in the fourth industrial revolution. Because we're talking Gen Z here, where the classical loyalties don't generally apply and there's a lot more mobility with skills. And they said that if you want to attract the best people into your sector or your company, you've got to provide 3 things. And I'll try and remember these. One of them is the capacity to master whatever it is that you're working on, so a degree of mastery over the subject matter, so they can get really good at something. The other was to be part of I'm pretty sure it was to be part of a team environment where there was stimulation and other people that could fuel that innovative juice, that you could feel that you were working as a collective towards a common goal. And the third thing they said was you had to have some higher purpose to what you were doing beyond just money, professional success. You had to actually believe that what you were working on was objectively good for humanity. And the reason for that apparently is that we all carry some innate need of purpose of some kind here on Earth, other than just, retiring to a vegetable garden or superannuation. I mean, there has to be something. They're saying that for these younger people coming through, the best and brightest, as it were, they want some social dimension to what they're doing. They want some sense that this is actually improving the human condition. So I think, just to maybe attempt to answer the question that we put at the beginning about getting rid of the BS, is maybe we can come back to a values discussion on what it is that we stand for as a company, as a sector. What is it? And not just words, but I mean, how do we demonstrate that in an authentic way? And maybe there is in that, Blair, some capacity to break through the noise through our actions in supporting the humans that are, both our market and also our collaborators.
That's all we have time for this week in Identity Today with me, Blair Crawford. I'd like to say a big thank you to our guest, Peter Coroneos, as well as a big thank you to you, our listeners. Don't forget to subscribe to the show, and if you want to know more about how to improve your cybersecurity posture with Daltrey, go to daltrey.com. Until next time.